Good morning. Welcome to the third Abolition University online education session sponsored by Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Today we're going to be looking at conservative opposition to the death penalty and the role of conservatives in the abolition movement. We have a terrific panel of speakers today, and looking forward to the interaction. We're going to have lead off with Hannah Cox, who is the, if I have the title right, Program Director for Conservatives Concerned about the Death Penalty. And she's going to provide a national perspective because she's been working in multiple states over the past few years. Then two of our board members are going to speak. Chris Braunlich, who's president of the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy, which is a free market conservative public policy think tank for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And Nick Cote, a very active Northern Virginia Libertarian who has been active in politics for a long time. And then finally, we're going to have our field director, Dale Brumfield, speak to talk about his interactions with conservative audiences in his time doing field work for us. So we're looking forward to having everyone speak. Again, I'm going to mute everybody so that if you have any questions, please submit them via the chat feature, and we should have time at the end to get through all the questions that you might have. So again, welcome, and I'm going to unmute you, Hannah, and there you go, and welcome to Hannah Cox.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and to meet all of you. I have been the Senior National Manager of Conservatives Concerned about the Death Penalty for the past 2 years, and we have been around for about 8 years in total. We went national in 2013 after a group of conservatives started forming this movement sort of organically in Montana. They felt that it was inconsistent for conservatives to support the death penalty, that it was a failed big government program marked by all of the error and corruptibility and problems that we see in so many other areas of government. And they also thought that it risked not only innocent human life, which we know it does, but that it also wasn't a pro-life position to ever suggest that human lives were disposable. And they also thought that it was extremely expensive. It wasn't in keeping with fiscal conservatism, and so it really failed to meet the values of conservatism as a whole. And they started loosely calling themselves conservatives concerned about the death penalty. And what they found was that there were actually a lot of conservatives who had been really questioning their stance on this position and didn't really have a place to organize or a place to go to flush that out with people that they trusted and who had a similar worldview. And so it took off rather quickly. And in 2013, we went national at CPAC and have been building ever since then. During that time, we've seen tremendous shifts in this country on the death penalty, but especially amongst Republicans and conservatives on the right. When we first started studying this through a report that we issued called The Right Way, we found that if you look at the year 2000, around that era, it was virtually unheard of to see a Republican state lawmaker introduce a piece of legislation to repeal the death penalty. But by 2012, that number had doubled, and by 2016, we saw it increase tenfold. For the past 2 years, while I have been leading this organization, we have seen over 50 Republican lawmakers at the state level every year sign their names as co-sponsors or sponsors of pieces of legislation to repeal the death penalty. And we've seen that done in 10 states or more in the past 2 years, which is really very impressive when you consider that only 25 states have active death penalty systems. Not only that, but we've seen dozens and dozens of other Republicans who have voted in favor of repealing the death penalty, but maybe didn't have their names signed on as sponsors. We also have seen a real movement kind of get some movement behind these repeal campaigns. It's not just being done symbolically. We're actually seeing them win. In New Hampshire in 2018, we did repeal the death penalty legislatively, even overriding a Republican governor's veto in both chambers, which was significant. That's very difficult to do, and the governor's campaign and his advisors had really worked very hard against that veto and had made it a partisan issue, and had been somewhat threatening that they would try to remove people from office who voted against him in that way. And still, people showed up to vote in that manner and were successful. So I thought that that was a really tremendous win, and one that we certainly would not have gotten without Republican support, significant Republican support in that state. And then this year, we saw the same thing happen in Colorado, where they had been trying for over 6 years to repeal the death penalty. They had a Democratic majority, and it kept failing, it kept failing, it kept failing. And finally, this year, what we saw were 3 Republican senators stand up and say, and that was where they really needed the votes, was in the Senate chamber, and say that this is not conservative, and this is not something that we will stand by, and this is something that we need to get rid of. And they worked very hard on that. And because of their efforts, we were successful in Colorado in repealing the death penalty within the first 2 months of 2020, which is a very quick turnaround. It was an impressive campaign to be a part of, and thank God we did it as quick as we did, because COVID would have interrupted our plans had we been even a couple of weeks later than where we were in that session. On top of that, we've seen real movement in states like Wyoming, which is a very red state. We had a young Republican state lawmaker, Jared Olson, who felt compelled to lead on this. We were not really a part of his initially introducing the bill. He did this on his own. And so we started watching it last year just out of curiosity. You know, we thought it was interesting that Wyoming was running with a bill, and it started moving very quickly. And before we knew it, he had actually passed it out of the House. And then we were on to the Senate, and we had vote counts that suggested we could win that. I still think that that was true, and we ended up losing just 2 or 3 people and lost it at a very narrow margin. But I think they will be back next year, and I do think Wyoming will be successful in repealing the death penalty at that point. They were only not doing it this year because they, every other year, have short budgetary sessions where it's pretty impossible to get anything not budget related introduced. So that's why we're having a bit of a gap year there. Outside of those campaigns, we're also seeing real movement in states like Ohio, which is traditionally a very high usage state. They have one of the largest death rows in the country and have been active in carrying out executions until very recently. That wasn't a state that the movement was looking at as a target for repeal anytime in the near future, to be totally honest. But what happened was they elected a new Republican governor, Governor Mike DeWine, a couple of years ago. And within his first couple of months in office, he removed the executions that had been scheduled for the immediate present and said that the evidence showed that this was not constitutional and that they wouldn't be carrying out executions under his watch until they found a way to do it. And he has continued to hold that posture over the course of a year and a half now, and they have not had another execution in that state. During that time, we've seen significant Republican leadership coming out in favor of getting rid of it. They have a ultra-conservative Speaker of the House in Ohio named Larry Householder, ironically, and he has been quite vocal in the media and talking about how he doesn't think that the death penalty is working or matching it with conservative values, and it's probably something that should be done away with, and has talked about trying to move that forward and looking at what those possibilities will be with his caucus. So I think that we could very, very likely see a real repeal campaign coming out of Ohio in the next year or two, and I think we could win there. That, I think, is a testament to just how far we've come in this country if we're talking about repealing the death penalty in very red states like Wyoming and in red and also high usage states like Ohio. I think if you do see that transpire, that point will be down to only a handful of states that still have active death penalty systems, which will predominantly be the Deep South, Southern Baptist strongholds. And I think that we will see some real movement even in those states, because increasingly they're going to have to answer for their high budgets around this issue. They're going to have to answer for the number of innocents that we've seen discovered in their systems. They are going to be competing for foreign investment dollars, which those states are heavily reliant on, and which we know will increasingly be heading towards states that don't have those kinds of systems, because the rest of the Western world has done away with the system, and they see this as a human rights violation. And so if they have the option to be in a tax-free state like Wyoming that doesn't have the death penalty, or a tax-free state like Tennessee that's killing people left and right, they're going to go to Wyoming when they're being courted. And that could be a real problem for states like Tennessee that are heavily reliant on those foreign investment dollars. So I think increasingly you will see pressure put on these very high usage southeastern states. And I think we could see change a lot sooner in those regions than many people might suspect as well. On top of that, besides just active repeal campaigns, we have launched 15 state chapters of Conservatives Concerned about the death penalty at this point. And those are networks of people on the ground that are comprised of conservatives and grass-top people who've been very active in their state political parties for many, many decades. They're comprised of people who have some sort of position as a stakeholder in this, by murder victims' family members, by former members of law enforcement and district attorneys and attorneys general and public defenders and judges, police officers, members of corrections. They're comprised of faith leaders across all denominations. And they're really doing tremendous work to educate people on the problems of the death penalty system, because I think that is really the only barrier we have left to repealing in this country. Most people who are in support of the death penalty have never been around the justice system in any meaningful capacity. They typically have a strong emotional reaction, which I think is very human and normal to have in the face of violence, and instinctively might say they support the death penalty. But in my experience, if you can even have a 5 to 10 minute elevator pitch with most people and just explain the way that the system is actually functioning, you typically see people will regress from their positions of support quite quickly. They might not become abolitionists who are marching next to me the next day, but they certainly will not be as active in their support or as vocal in their support. And at the end of the day, we've never been a part of a state repeal campaign that has had any organized opposition other than DA's conferences or maybe police associations in some format. And so to sit in these committee rooms across the country and see the bulk of the people sitting on the side of repeal giving testimony for hours upon hours upon hours, and then to see the dwindling small numbers of people who are there to testify in support of keeping it is a very stark contrast. And you see one side show up with data and facts and personal involvement, and you see the other side show up largely with fear-mongering and a desire to keep their power. And it's working. I think you can see through that when you start looking at what's happening in these committee rooms. It's pretty transparent who's on the right side and who isn't. And so I believe that will continue to happen. And I think the groundwork that we're laying in the states where we have chapters will also significantly impact repeal campaigns down the road, because as more and more people are being educated about these flaws, as more and more people are getting the elevator pitch for why this doesn't work, we will see those coalitions broaden and continue to see more people showing up to actually push for repeal. So we are just very excited about this momentum in the country. I think there is a real zeitgeist for change. We've seen the approval rates for criminal justice reform just skyrocket in recent years. This is one of the few issues Republicans and Democrats are agreeing on and really working together on at this point. And I think that's a testament to just how bad our system is when people are in mass agreement that this is a problem we need to fix and that government is not the solution at the end of the day here. And we need to get this system off of people's backs and redirect our dollars to programs that could actually work to deter violence in the first place and towards solving more crimes, which we still do very little of in this country. We only solve about 60% of homicides on average every year. And for violent crimes such as rape, and for property crimes, the numbers are even smaller than that. And so we need to make sure that we are investing our dollars in programs that actually work. And the death penalty is certainly not one that does. So I will leave it there. I'm happy to answer questions later if anybody has any, but would love to plug people in with our work and get excited for the next year.
Thank you, Hannah. Just a couple points I'd maybe ask you to reflect on it. In my experience, conservatism is a very broad term, but in my experience, it's made up of many different components. Main Street business Republicans, Tea Party folk, pro-lifers, Second Amendment advocates, Trump populists, never Trumpers, and libertarians of different perspectives. And the other thing that I've noticed is that there seems to be a real generational difference in perspective between older Republicans and Democrats, for that matter, and much younger lawmakers. The older ones seem to still be locked into that law and order, lock them up and throw away the key pro-death penalty perspective, while the younger generation seems less locked into that perspective. And I'm wondering if you see if you see any differences between the different perspectives in the conservative movement on this issue, and do you see the same kind of generational differences across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always asked, what's the one argument that's winning Republicans over? And I always say there's not one argument that's winning Republicans over. You're absolutely right that the party is very much fractured into different segments that have pretty different ideologies if you really boil it down. And so the thing about the death penalty is there are so many problems with it. There are so many flaws that there's actually something for everybody. Tea Party conservatives who are more concerned with budgets and taxes and where our dollars are being allocated are probably going to be more concerned with the money that we're spending on the system and the opportunity cost it presents. The pro-life faction that is more evangelical is probably going to be more concerned with the innocence issues and with the racial disparity in the system, and on and on and on. And so certainly I think that you can reach all of these different segments within Republicanism through all of the flaws in the death penalty. There's not just one that works. There's just so many issues that there's kind of something for everybody to grab onto and that will stir them up. And I think that's why, again, we're seeing success. But certainly there is a generational gap. I think that's not just with our issue, that's with many issues, and probably is an argument for why some people shouldn't be in office so long. But we are seeing younger people become much more educated about these things. They're more online. They see videos more often of incidents. They probably are watching true crime documentaries and listening to podcasts. I think that the true crime entertainment boom has done significant work in helping us reach people and really helping them see behind the curtain of the justice system in ways that they probably hadn't before. And they're realizing how fallible it is and how corruptible it is. And so they're feeling very motivated to change. When I'm speaking to a younger audience and I say, there's been one person exonerated for every 10 executions in this country, they're like, oh yeah, I know. Did you see this documentary about this innocence case? Or did you hear about this incident? And they're very much in it and a bit more familiar with it. If I say there's racial disparity in how we are applying our justice system, they say, oh yeah, did you see the video of George Floyd this week with the cop who had his boot on his neck? Whereas my parents, who are boomers, they probably aren't seeing those videos. I'm taking it to them and saying, did you see this? But they're just not as cued in those ways for the most part. There is exceptions to that, of course. So I think they're less likely to have encountered some of this and to have been educated as much. I don't find a difference generationally when I'm giving a speech. If I get the opportunity to present to a Republican luncheon club and there's millennials and there's Gen Z and there's whatever comes ahead of millennials, that forgotten generation, and boomers, I see a pretty equal response, actually. I see a lot of people who just are shocked. And I think that was my first reaction when I was first changing my mind on the death penalty was, how could I have been so wrong? How did I not know any of this? I need to do better and be more thoughtful in how I'm determining my policy. And that's more the reaction I get. So I think the older generation is a little harder to reach, but I don't think that they are impossible to move.
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, next I want to turn things over to Chris Braunlich to talk about his perspective as a very active Republican here in the Commonwealth. There you go.
Well,
Chris.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I'm less of an active Republican than I used to be, but I'm certainly active in the conservative movement. And I can make this real quick. What Hannah said, I mean, just about everything Hannah said. This little device has equalized an awful lot of things for a big generation and an increasing generation of adults, where once there might have been 2 or 3 people standing around watching something. Now it's millions, literally, because they see it after the fact, and they learn very quickly that what you're told ain't always what's really the truth. I think that the key for us is if you're a conservative, you're probably skeptical. You're skeptical about big business. You're skeptical about big unions. You're skeptical about big government. And if you are skeptical that the education system is working well, if you're skeptical that the social welfare system is working well, they are bureaucracies. So is the criminal justice system. If they make mistakes, the criminal justice system is going to make mistakes. And when conservatives start thinking about that aspect of it, it becomes very logical for them. They simply say, well, yeah, that makes sense. And the key with this is that with the death penalty, if you make a mistake, you can't cut it. The state can't cut a check for $100,000 or $200,000 and say, here, we're sorry. It's permanent. You can't go back. You can't, there are no give backs on that. And I think that ultimately that gets to the heart of an awful lot of people, because most conservatives tend to be fairly pro-life, and that will resonate with them, I think. Conservatives have always been, Paul had interviewed me a while back, and conservatives there have always been conservatives that were against the death penalty. I came to this in high school when I read things that William F. Buckley wrote. I think that the politics of this, as you pointed out, Michael, the let's lock them away, we're going to be tough on crime. I mean, that generated very quickly in the late 60s, and it held on for an awfully long time. But I think that people are starting to look at the real record now and concluding it isn't working the way it's supposed to work. And I think they're going to start backing off. The politics of it, though, is that if you want to get that changed, you've got to find someone who can break through all the clutter, is an outright political spokesman, not a Bill Buckley, but someone else, outright political spokesman. And I assume you're going to get into that a little later, because it's the reason I think we're on the cusp of a very big victory here in Virginia. And I'll leave it at that.
Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Why don't you go ahead and delve into that?
Well, I think that, and you know it better than I, Senator Bill Stanley made a speech on the floor of the Senate talking about, it was a severe mental illness bill, but basically unscripted said, when a death penalty abolition bill comes here, I will vote for it. And said it openly, said it profoundly, had people come up to him afterwards, and I don't know which ones were private conversations and which weren't, so I won't repeat them. But clearly, I think that there are people in the General Assembly, conservatives in the General Assembly, who are looking for someone who will lead on some of that. And Stanley's an independent cuss in respects, and I don't think he cares about the politics of it all. The stories I've heard about him is he's going to do what he thinks is right, and that can take us a very long way.
Yeah, just a remark about Senator Stanley. For those who don't know him, he represents a broad swath of Southern Virginia along the North Carolina border, probably as conservative a part of the state as you're going to find. He's a very big Second Amendment advocate. He took the Commonwealth to court over some of the restrictions imposed by the pandemic. Very much interested in individual liberty. But privately, he had told us for years that he was opposed to the death penalty. He considered the death penalty to be on par with abortion, and that as somebody who opposed abortion, he felt he was conscience bound to also oppose capital punishment. But he was always, I think, hesitant to speak publicly about it. And this is where politics can get very personal and individual. His best friend in the state Senate was a fellow Republican from Southwest Virginia who had had a loved one murdered. And as a result of that experience, was a strong proponent of the death penalty. So I think Senator Stanley never wanted to vote against his friend or speak on the other side of his friend on this issue. And it was only when that senator retired last year that I think he finally felt free to speak his mind on this issue within the Senate. And we were hoping that he might take that step this year, but we had no idea he was going to speak as powerfully as he did on the floor of the Senate when they were debating a bill to exempt people with severe mental illness from the death penalty. And in fact, his speech on the floor flipped 5 Republican votes who had opposed that bill the prior year into supporting it this year, so that it won 32-7. 11 of the 19 Republicans voted for that bill. And so we're going to be honoring Senator Stanley with our Legislator of the Year award at our annual luncheon in October, assuming we're going to be able to gather for that luncheon. And if not, we'll do it virtually. And we're hoping to have a conversation with him about strategy. I know Senator Suderline from the Roanoke area has said publicly that he has to reconsider his position on capital punishment in light of Senator Stanley's comments. And we think there are others. I'm going to ask Senator Stanley to help identify who those folks are and maybe help us get meetings with them to see if we can move them over that border into the abolition camp. So again, I agree with you totally, Chris. This is a very exciting and promising time. And I think all it takes is one Republican to say, or one lawmaker to say, politics be damned, and to speak his or her mind. And that gives permission for others in that chamber to question orthodoxy and to reconsider their positions. So, so thanks a lot, Chris. I'm now
might even get a couple of Democrats to reconsider their positions. They don't want to be to the right of the Republicans. So.
Well, I think there are a couple of Republicans some Democrats in the Senate that are going to be lost causes. And again, I think this sort of speaks to the issue that the death penalty is one of those issues that can cause people to cross expectations of party. You expect Republicans, because it's in their platform, to support the death penalty, but that certainly isn't always true. And likewise, there are a number of Democrats, particularly in the older generation, who are steadfast supporters of capital punishment, including the Senate Democratic leader, Dick Saslaw. And he talks about being damn proud of being the author of the current capital punishment law in the Commonwealth. So politics are very interesting on this issue, and that party affiliation doesn't always tell how someone is going to vote. And so now I want to introduce Nick Cote, another one of our board members who's going to be coming at this from his perspective as an active libertarian. So Nick, welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
It's great to be here, Michael. I really appreciate having this opportunity. I just start with some sort of personal background. It's sometimes when I hear somebody introduce me as a libertarian, I think about what my father would think if he heard that. He's heard it many times, but I was raised by sort of typical New England liberals, and my father has joked before, "What did I do wrong? If he turned out the way that he did." But what was important to me about my parents and how they raised me is they very much encouraged me to think for myself. I remember very strongly, this would have been in the mid-90s, I once saw a joke, I think it was about Newt Gingrich. There was a joke posted in a doctor's office, and I repeated it to my father, who probably agreed with the sentiment behind the joke, but he was sort of troubled by the fact that I was just regurgitating something I had seen without sort of thinking it through for myself. And he very much encouraged me to read on my own, to debate him, to think through, various issues. And in high school, what that sort of ended up meaning for me is that I became a lowercase L libertarian. I wasn't a member or really, interested in third-party politics at the time. And the issues I was mostly thinking about were economic regulation, taxes, government suppression of political speech were probably the things that were most important to me. Now, I would say most libertarians would probably say that they oppose the death penalty for a number of reasons, but at the time I was actually a supporter of the death penalty. My logic was that as a society, when people commit certain crimes, and as a libertarian, I believe there should be fewer of those crimes, and the punishments for them should potentially be much less strict. But I believe, people commit certain crimes, and as a society, what we do is we then take away their liberty when they, for instance, have taken away somebody else's liberty, when they've committed violence against another person, when they've, stolen somebody else's property. That it's appropriate as a society to take away their liberty. And it sort of just followed to me. It made a certain logical sense then that if you take away somebody else's life, you take away their right to life, that society similarly can exercise the power to take away your life. I didn't really think through a lot of the implications of what that meant, as I later did. And that journey kind of started in college. As I said before, I was mostly interested in economic issues and the First Amendment. But in college, I started reading a lot more about the criminal justice system. And in particular, there was a libertarian writer. When I first started reading him, he was a policy analyst at the Cote Institute, a libertarian think tank. And then he went over to Reason magazine, a libertarian magazine, and then later more mainstream journalism at the Huffington Post and now the Washington Post. Name is Radley Balco. And he had, I knew Hannah would, probably knows the story that I'm about to refer to very well. He introduced me to the story of a man named Corey May, an African-American man in Mississippi who had been convicted of murder in 2001 and sort of the certain facts of the case were never in dispute. He did, in fact, shoot and kill a police officer. But when I learned more about the facts of the case, what happened leading up to that event, and what happened at trial, I became pretty outraged at the case, and that led me to question a lot about the criminal justice system, including the death penalty. It was a case that, so just very quick details of the case. Radley Balco was asleep at home. It was about 2 or 3 in the morning. He was a law-abiding man, other than the fact that he occasionally consumed, or I don't know if the facts are even established that he occasionally consumed marijuana, but there was a marijuana cigarette found in his duplex. But what happened was the police had a warrant for the other side of the duplex, the other homeowner, and they exercised a no-knock warrant in the middle of the night on the wrong side of the duplex. So he thought his home was being invaded. It was not a particularly safe neighborhood, a high-crime neighborhood. He thought his home was being invaded in the middle of the night, and he did what I think a lot of people would do. He reacted and tried to defend his family, including his infant daughter, who was asleep in the bedroom with him. And he didn't hear police announce that they were police officers. He just thought his home was being invaded. So he, in my opinion, as a libertarian, exercised his Second Amendment rights. He happened to have a gun, on him and fired at who he thought were violent intruders breaking into his home. And then there were later, subsequent issues with how the warrant was obtained. The counsel that he received at trial. The trial was moved to a different locality with a different jury makeup. There were racial issues. There were so many just issues that compounded on top of what ended up happening. And this was a case that actually got a lot of attention in libertarian and conservative media. Even a lot of conservatives who otherwise might support the death penalty were pretty outraged by the case, because they saw it as a man exercising his rights and defending his family and his home from who he thought was violent intruders. Fortunately, Corey May was subsequently freed. It was a very long case that took years, and you can read more about it. I would highly recommend a book by Radley Balco and Tucker Carrington from the Mississippi Innocence Project, called the Cadaver King and the County Dentist. That's another part of it. There was really, I learned about some of the so-called expert testimony that is often used in capital cases that relies on some really shoddy science. And I would highly recommend reading that book to learn, if you want to learn more about that. So later, as time went on, I just became more interested in criminal justice issues in general. And I was really, when I moved to Virginia, I was pretty outraged at the slow pace of progress on those reforms here in Virginia, because a lot of other states, very conservative states like Texas and Utah come to mind, were passing a lot of really comprehensive criminal justice reforms. But in Virginia, we couldn't even get votes on the floor. There were unfortunately, a couple of powerful committee and subcommittee chairmen who would kill even very minor criminal justice reform legislation that even might have passed at the time if it actually reached the floor for a vote. But unfortunately, they all died in committee. And then I saw a ray of hope for criminal justice reform in general, and even the death penalty abolition in 2015. Governor Terry McAuliffe he was ultimately successful, but his initial attempt to pass legislation that would exempt from the Freedom of Information Act information related to the procurement of the drugs used for lethal injection. So he wanted to basically prevent people of Virginia from finding out what are the drugs they're using, how did they obtain them. There are a lot of issues related to that, because even the way that they obtain them is often in violation of contracts with the drug manufacturers. The drug manufacturers, as far as they're concerned, they're pharmaceutical companies that are creating medicine to save people's lives, and they don't believe that they should be used to kill. So there are often very troubling ways that these drugs are obtained to be used for lethal injection. So the state of Virginia was having difficulty obtaining drugs. So the governor had proposed a policy to exempt from public disclosure information related to the procurement of these drugs. So as I said, I saw a ray of hope at the time, because a number of very conservative Republicans in Virginia actually opposed the initial attempt by Governor McAuliffe to pass this execution secrecy legislation. There were, Tea Party Republicans who, very strongly believed in government accountability. They were questioning why this was happening. So I invited Michael, who at the time had just joined VADP as the executive director, to come speak to a group of libertarians in Northern Virginia about this ongoing fight, and how they could help. And then subsequently after that, Michael invited me to join the board of VADP, and I've been very happy to serve ever since. So in general, if I could just say a brief general word about my sort of journey on the death penalty. As I said, I used to be in favor of it, and I sort of can still see an intellectual argument the one that I made earlier. But the practice on the ground, the way that the criminal justice system actually works, the racial disparities that happen, there's just the likelihood of executing innocents. There are just so many reasons to oppose it. And then just more broadly, I think, if I'm somebody who opposes big government, well, there is no bigger government than a government that kills. That is the biggest act a government can take. That is the most awesome power government can possibly wield. And it does not exercise it in a prudent way. It does not exercise it in a just way. And so I can no longer find any reason to support the death penalty. And I'm now happy to work and try to recruit other conservatives and libertarians to join the fight.
Well, thanks, Nick. It's interesting that you use that perspective. Former Republican Attorney General Mark Earley oversaw 36 executions in his time in office. And several years ago, he wrote a law review article for the University of Richmond that outlined his opposition to the death penalty. And he used a very similar argument to the one you used, Nick, and said, I could make an intellectual argument for the death penalty, but it's tired, forced, and I no longer find it persuasive. And I think that's where a lot of conservatives are in terms of the death penalty. So Dale, I'm going to turn things over to you. Dale has been our field director now for about 3 years and has made monumental progress in broadening increasing the number of libertarians and Republicans and other conservatives into VADP and the death penalty movement in general. So Dale, please share some of your perspectives from your experience.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. And thank you all for being with us today. 3 years ago, when I first took this job, my primary focus was on only Republican groups and Libertarian groups in 6 targeted legislative jurisdictions around Virginia. And what I found in trying to get into, first of all, I had a very tough time getting in front of these Republicans, but I eventually started getting in front of them. And I started speaking to groups in Chatham, Virginia, which is in Pittsylvania County, one of the reddest and most law and order counties you're going to find in Virginia. I had a very good talk down there. I talked out in Zion Crossroads. I went to Smith Mountain Lake, talking to these Republican groups. And then I went and after I started making some headway with some of these Republicans, I was invited by Equal Justice USA and Conservatives Concerned to go to CPAC. And I thought, oh, well, here we go, the belly of the beast. So I went to CPAC in 2018 and came away rather surprised, actually. I found that at least the ones who came to our booth, the Republicans who were coming up to our booth, were saying, not wanting so much to get in our face and debate the death penalty. They'd come up and look at the sign and they'd say, why should I support death penalty abolition? So I'd tell them why, and never talking about the pro-life argument or any of that, talking about the costs, the racial disparities, the lack of deterrence, and possibility of innocence. And they say, well, okay, yeah, I'm with you on this. And they'd sign up on our mailing list and leave. I go, well, this is not so bad. And to Hannah, to go off what you were saying about generational differences, in 2019, I went back with Hannah and Heather Baudouin and a couple of others to CPAC again. And it was even more stark, the generational difference. The young Republicans who would come up to our booth were on board. And what they wanted to know was, how can I defend being against the death penalty? How do I do it? You know, I am against the death penalty, but I want to know how to properly defend my position. So I had this wonderful opportunity to stand there and tell them, well, here's all you need to do. So in 2019 at CPAC, I only had 1 or 2, and I call it the OWG Republican who comes up. It's an old white guy. And those are the ones that are the hardest to turn over. They just tend to be more law and order traditionalists. And they're the ones who want to stand there and debate. And listening to their debate, you'll hear they're working on emotion. They believe in the theory of the death penalty without knowing anything about the actual process. So once we start talking about the process, even they go, well, you know what? And I even had a couple say, all right, well, you convinced me. So that was very gratifying to hear. And at CPAC also, I met a member of the Virginia Federation of Republican Women who happened to be there. So she and I were talking. She's all for death penalty repeal. And she said, well, I'm a member of the Springfield chapter of the VFRW. I said, well, can I come talk to your chapter? And she said, well, yeah, let me talk to them and see if you can. So I did. I got a chance to go get in front of these 16 women, all Republicans, all older, and talk about the death penalty. And we had 8 of them, including their leadership, sign up to our mailing list. And that's always my goal, is to get them on our mailing list. So that was pretty gratifying. And I wound up getting in front of, I think, 4 or 5 of those groups. And I was a vendor at their conference for 2 years in a row. So I was making tremendous headway with the Republican women. But then all of a sudden, they kind of, their platform imploded. I don't know what happened, and I have not been able to get much headway since then. But my focus shifted much since the Democratic takeover of the House and the Senate, and of course our Democrat governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general. My focus has shifted a little bit. Now, talking to libertarians, I always say to the libertarian groups, no offense, Nick, they're low-hanging fruit. I mean, talking to a group of libertarians is really easy because they were all on board and 100% sign up. And it's like, well, you know what, this is great. And it's great to talk to a group that's all 100% with you, but those aren't the minds that I really need to change. I need to get in front of the tough groups. And some Democrat groups have been tough, but you know, I don't mind going in front of a tough group. I always say this is a no judgment presentation. I don't care if you're for it, against it, on the fence, or have no opinion whatsoever. And our goal is to leave as friends. Okay, nothing argumentative here. So it's been very encouraging. And in the 3 years I've been doing this job, I've seen a big change in the field with not just Republicans, Libertarians, but some Democrats as well. They seem to be more open to listening, and they seem to have a more stronger opinion that the death penalty simply is not working. And I think one of the things is, once again, the generational issue where the younger ones are going to the older ones. They look at this video, look what's going on. Millions of people are watching these things, these transgressions in law enforcement and criminal justice. And more people are seeing them, and it's making them more aware that the system is really shattered. And with the death penalty, like Nick and Chris were saying, there's no going back. You can't release them from the grave. You can always release them out of jail if you're wrong, but you can't get them out of the ground. So it's very encouraging to see the change in attitude that's going on across Virginia.
All right, thanks, Dale. If anyone has questions, use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to send them to me. And let me just open it up to any of the panelists that, do you have any anything you'd like to comment on, from what others have said?
Well, Dale did trigger a memory for me that I thought was just kind of a funny tidbit from this past session in Colorado. But when you talk about the old white guy, there is that subsect in Republicanism that you meet, and they're just like, they just won't change their minds. Like, you could throw every bit of evidence at them, and they literally will say to me, "I'm too old. Yep. I'm just too old. Sorry." And that's rare for me. I don't find that guy often, but I did have a funny encounter in Colorado this year. I was working on one of the Republican House members, and he was just really struggling. Sorry, I'm on a screen-in porch, and there was the loudest frog I've ever heard in my life next to me. But he said to me at the end of our conversation, he said, "I think you might be the best lobbyist that's ever come in my office. Like, you're really, really good." Right. And I said, "No, I really, really have the facts on my side. Like, there is no reason to be in support of the system. And that's why I'm very good at this, because all the data is in my corner, right? Like, I just have to tell you the facts." And he kind of, you could tell he felt sad about it. He said, "I don't think I can do it. I'm just too old. I'm sorry. But like, I think your arguments are convincing." And so it is disappointing when you encounter that guy, because you can tell like it's some kind of pride or egotistical thing. They just can't bring themselves to change on it. And those conversations, you kind of just have to walk away. But that just made me think of that memory, and I thought it was kind of a funny conversation.
Yeah, I've had several of those too.
Yeah, yesterday I had a very interesting conversation with a Democratic lawmaker in the Virginia General Assembly. She also kind of falls in that camp, knows that she should oppose the death penalty, but doesn't know if she could cast that vote. It's just very interesting. So it's bipartisan. One question that came up, have you been able to have any constructive interaction with district attorneys? Here in Virginia, they're called Commonwealth's attorneys, and it's an elected office. And historically, that had been a really tough audience, though Dale had made a bit of a breakthrough at one of the Virginia Republican women's conferences. Dale, do you want to comment about that?
Yeah, this woman just came up to my table and told me, she goes, "Well, I'm the Commonwealth's attorney for the city of Lynchburg." Her name was Bethany Harrison. She just got elected. She was the first female Commonwealth's attorney in the city of Lynchburg, and she's a Republican. And she said, I'm against the death penalty." And I said, "Well, can we open up a dialogue with you?" And so I think, Michael, you got to go meet her and talk to her for an hour and a half one day. And you might want to share what you all talked about. But that kind of opened the door, and all of a sudden, it seemed like more and more Commonwealth attorneys have suddenly come on board, especially when the Democrats have stood up and publicly said, like in Fairfax, they said, "I'm ending the death penalty in Fairfax. I will not pursue it at all while I'm in office." So more and more of these, and we actually had a sign-on letter of Commonwealth attorneys this year, and I don't remember the exact number, Michael, you'll have to fill me in on that, but we had several Commonwealth attorneys start signing on with help from, I think, the ACLU of Virginia helped us with that, right?
No, it was Justice Forward Virginia. Justice Forward
VA did it. But anyway, so yes, progress, thanks. It's all started with this Republican woman that I met, and it seemed to get the ball rolling with other CAs. Now, the chore now is to get the Commonwealth Attorneys Association to at least be neutral about it. And that would be a huge step for us if they took no stand.
Now, basically, we had 21 current and former Virginia prosecutors sign that letter calling for abolition, including 2 former attorneys general, one Democratic and one Republican. And we're working to get more, we're hoping to at least double that number before the next session of the General Assembly, hopefully as many as 50. And there are a number that I think are willing to be supportive of us, but aren't willing to be public. So they're more private supporters, where they may call the elected legislators from their area saying, I really don't see any need for the death penalty anymore, and I would encourage you to consider voting for abolition, or lobbying with their own association to take a neutral position. So we need help both publicly as well as behind the scenes from those folks. Yeah, it's very encouraging. Lots of things are moving in our direction, and if we can get a clean vote in committee and then on the floor of the legislature this coming session, I'm cautiously optimistic we could win. I think we have the votes in committee and on the floor in the House. It'll be close, but if we can get it out of Judiciary Committee in the Senate, I think we'll have the votes on the floor to abolish next year. But everything's going to have to align just right for that to happen. But with growing support from conservatives in the legislature, that will happen. And it's really important for it to be truly bipartisan, because it's far less likely to become an electoral issue in subsequent elections if you can say that a decent number of Republicans joined most Democrats in this, because there are some Democrats we're just never going to get for abolition. And so the more we can make it a bipartisan win, the more secure that's going to be from any future legislatures. We have time maybe for one more question, if there is one. And if not, any of the panelists, do you have any closing comments before we sign off? All right. Well, again, thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate it, and have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.